this is a very destabilizing situation. And for that reason, I think Trump carries a lot of responsibility in this current crisis.
According to the Russians, it isn't just the Trump stuff, though. According to Dmitry Peskov today, there's some European elements of this as well.
Россия последовательно занимается обеспечением собственной безопасности. Именно в русле этой задачи и происходит разработка новых систем вооружений, к коим относятся озвученные системы. Обеспечение безопасности для России является вопросом жизненно важным, особенно на фоне того милитаристского настроя, который мы сейчас слышим от европейцев в первую очередь. Европейцы действительно находятся в состоянии такой внутренней истерики, русофобской, агрессивной и воинственной.
So for those who may not be able to read those words at the small bottom of the screen there, he's basically saying, listen, we have our European security is very important to Russia, and we are getting lots of bellicose statements and talking about rearm Europe. They're talking about moving troops closer. The German troops are actually in the Balts already. You have the French leaders, military leader claiming that, hey, we could be at war with Russia pretty soon, so we got to get ready. Britain's saying the same thing. Is that just rhetoric, or how does that affect the continental security system?
Well, it's rhetoric, but it has also an impact on the political decision making. You see, and there is also something that I didn't mention, but probably needs to be taken into account. Remember that a couple of months ago, that was earlier this year, Zelensky apparently told Trump that he was ready to have nuclear weapons, and they were in fact working on having their own nuclear weapons. So that was in fact when Zelensky said that was short before the RIM-2, the Grom-2, the missile I just mentioned before, was presented publicly. So I don't know exactly if the Ukrainians are working on that, or if it was just a declaration from Zelensky just to blackmail the Americans in a certain sense, but by saying, if you don't give us weapon, then we'll go nuclear on our own. I don't know exactly what was behind this, but what we can see is that the situation that we are seeing on the battlefield now in Ukraine shows or provokes for the Ukrainians kind of a trend towards escalation. And we have the same thing on the European side, because the Europeans apparently absolutely have no moderation effect on the whole conflict. I mean, at least even if we can, I'm not sure Trump is extremely effective in his attempt to stop the conflict, but at least he tries something. At least he has started a dialogue with Russia. At least he met Putin. At least he had several meetings with both Zelensky and Putin. He had also a phone conversation with them. At least that. It was not very effective so far. Okay, but at least he's doing that. On the European side, on the other hand, those people are absolutely not in favor of any kind of negotiation. On the contrary, they are trying to escalate the conflict. And since they are not able to provide additional weapons, they are trying to use other weapons, such as sanctions, freezing, not freezing, but seizing literally the Russian assets. So there is in Europe, there is a kind of hysteria, and I think that's a word that Peskov is using, which is, I think, totally legitimate in that case. There is kind of hysteria in Europe to try to escalate the conflict, since they see that the situation is going more dramatic every day on the battlefield. They can't do anything. They don't want to negotiate. They don't want to allow Zelensky, because remember that Zelensky tried on 3 occasions to have a political settlement of the conflict. And on the 3 occasions, that was prevented by the Europeans themselves. So meaning that the Europeans are completely in a kind of mood to escalate the conflict. And I'm not sure those the leaders in Europe have realized the implications for the situation, the security in Europe, in fact.
Okay, so let me ask you this question in light of that. So I think we can very safely assume that you're correct there, that the Europeans are only bent on more military support. They literally don't even talk about diplomacy. Yeah. So let me ask you, from the perspective of the Russian side, and what impact that could have on the conduct and eventually the outcome of this war, if they see on the European side, number one, that there's zero interest or even much less even an effort to go into negotiate a settlement, then you back over to the United States side, to use your analogy there. You know, the Trump has said yes sometimes, no sometimes, maybe, whatever on the Tomahawk missiles, but then that also extends into the diplomacy, because on the one hand he talks about, yes, I want to bring this war to an end, I'm tired of the killing, etc. And then on the other hand he says, you know what, how's about we do a bunch of sanctions here? And some of Trump's biggest supporters on American media are saying that's not enough, you need to do more. Here's Jack Keane.
So where are we now? President's taken the gloves off. He said, I've had enough of this extended diplomacy. I've run out of patience with Putin. I've given him as much rope as possible. I think this is the beginning. And yes, these are real sanctions. Everyone who's looked at it knows that they have to be enforced. It takes enormous vigilance on the part of the Treasury and the State Department to make sure it's working. And he's got a bunch of other sanctions in the quiver, not the least of which is Senator Lindsey Graham and Senator Blumenthal's proposed legislation, which would slap 500% tariffs on anybody purchasing Russian oil. And so, the president has, that whole ghost fleet out there of tankers. The president can go after that. So he's got more to do on the sanction area. Okay,
if you're Russia and you have all these inputs, these kind of like Jekyll and Hyde inputs from the U.S. and the only Jekyll inputs from the European Union, obviously Zelensky, I could have used several sound bites for him just in the last couple of days, to where he continues very consistent, has no interest in a negotiated settlement, anything short of his outcome, which is never going to happen on the other side. So what then is left for Russia? How do they make sense of all this very convoluted Western side?
Well, I think Russia will do exactly what they are doing. That means they will increase the pressure on Ukraine. They will continue to destroy completely Ukraine, in fact, but they will not give up with a political solution. Remember that the mindset of the military doctrine or a military approach of war in Russia is that war is the continuation of politics with other means, meaning that you can always shift from war on the ground to politics. And that's exactly what we have seen in the past. The Russians have been very consistent into that. If you come with a political solution, they will slow down on the military. If you don't have a political solution, they will increase the pressure on the military. The idea being that you will use the military to create a pressure on the Ukrainians. That was exactly the idea of reaching Kiev in February 2022. That was not to take Kiev, but to put pressure on Kiev, on the government, to engage into negotiation. And in fact, it's exactly what happened, because the special military operation started on the 24th of February. On the 25th of February, that means one day later, Zelensky called the Swiss foreign minister to ask organizing a peace conference, meaning that this idea of combining military pressure with political solution is something that the Russians will always do. The problem is that since obviously the Russians feel that there is no result on the politics side, they will increase pressure. And that increase of pressure gives more room for the hawks in the Kremlin, because as we know and as you know, the Putin is not the more radical, and you have a lot of other politicians in Russia that in fact are asking Putin to put more pressure on Ukraine, to attack much more and to destroy much more Ukraine. In fact, it's Putin that is pulling the brake because he doesn't want to destroy Ukraine. That was not his objective. Remember that in April 2022, he was ready to withdraw all troops from Ukraine in exchange of the neutrality of Ukraine, meaning that for Putin, the destruction of Ukraine is not on the agenda. The problem is that since he has no other mean to exert some kind of pressure on Ukraine, he will continue to do so. And if the hawks in the Kremlin manage to convince him, I mean, that can escalate the conflict. I think Putin is resisting that, and probably this presentation of the Burevestnik missile is probably the illustration that he prefers to show some muscle without going too hard against the population, even if
I want to camp on that for a second before we get off of that. The point you just made here, because I think it is so vital for our audience to understand, and even more vital for the West to understand, and we don't. And that is the motivation. You just said it was not in the cards. Russia did not intend to conquer all of Ukraine at the beginning. You've said that many times on our show, and the evidence certainly concludes that. But when you listen to what the West is saying, they seem to have, I don't know whether they're just saying this or whether they actually believe it, but in any case, their actions are predicated on it. Here is Jack Keane again, framing what he thinks is the Russian objectives.
Putin's objectives are to topple a government in Ukraine, take the country over, use that as an anchor to expand into Eastern Europe. How do we know that? Because that's what he said time and time again. He's got two false narratives out there to support him in that. One, the justification for doing it in the first place, because NATO is encroaching with the new Eastern European members that they took on beginning in the 1990s, who used to be part of the Soviet Union, didn't want any part of being part of Russia going forward, saw them as a threat and wanted the protection of NATO. Putin turns that around and says, Eastern Europe is encroaching on us. And that is a security problem that we have. That is absolute rubbish. But there's people in the United States who have bought into that false narrative.
See, so yeah, it's all the, I mean, he just said, he goes, they keep saying it. No, they actually don't keep saying it. They say the opposite. As a matter of fact, here is just one example. Also, maybe even from today, I think it might have been from today or yesterday, where Lavrov said very clearly, it's not about territory, it's about people.
But we could never think that the people who live on these territories which you listed, which are now in our constitution, that these people would be considered second sort, especially after the coup 11 years ago in February 2014, when the putschists took power by illegal bloody coup. It is not for territories for us. It is about the people who have been living on those lands for centuries.
So if you have mentalities that are so polar opposite in what the West thinks, and I think a lot of people, whether Jack Keane actually believes that or not, maybe secondary, lots of people do genuinely believe that Russia's just out to conquer everything because that's in their nature, et cetera. And then the Russians are saying it's always been about the people here and it remains. If you have those kinds of construct, the mental construct, how is it even possible to get to an end of war negotiation short of the Russian side winning on the battlefield?
Well, asking the question is answering the question to some extent, because when you see generals, I mean, you are military. I used to be a military. When we make a decision as a military, we tend to base our decision on facts, not just on fantasies. And here we have a general that makes an assessment based on fantasy. The Russians have never said they would take over any, not even the power in Kiev. And I think the Russians would, by all means, to avoid this, by the way, and certainly not to attack any country in Western Europe. They don't even reacted when the Baltic states joined NATO. The problem that became a concern about NATO was when the US, after scrapping the ABM treaty that we mentioned before, the Bush administration started to engage with Poland and Romania in order to deploy anti-ballistic missiles on their territories. And as you probably know, those anti-ballistic missile systems that are deployed in Romania and in Poland are also suited for ballistic missiles, meaning that if you see that from Moscow, there is an uncertainty about what is in those silos. And that created the problem. That's exactly the same scenario that we had as Turkey joined NATO in 1952. I mean, the Soviets were not pleased about this, but they didn't react. The reaction came in 1962 when the US decided to deploy nuclear missiles in Turkey. And that was the trigger for the Cuban Missile Crisis, because then the Soviets said, okay, you want to put missiles there, we put missiles in Cuba. And that created this situation. And later, the crisis was at the last minute solved. The Soviets didn't deploy their missiles in Cuba, but the US had to withdraw their missiles from Turkey. So we have exactly the same thing. It's not NATO as such which is the threat. The problem is that there is this appetite from the US to deploy those missiles right at the border with Russia. That creates the problem, you see? And that's exactly why the Russians are now extremely careful about the advance of NATO. It's not just about the few tanks that you may have at the border. I mean, this is not the problem. But the missile, because when you have a ballistic missile that is stationed in Poland, obviously your warning time is extremely short. And in fact, it doesn't allow for assessment of the threat. You are almost obliged to reply or to respond directly with nuclear weapons. And that's something that is extremely destabilizing. And that's something I don't understand why the US don't understand this. I mean, not you, but those who deploy those missiles, obviously. And that's the source of the concern. Now, the Russians have always said, and that's what Lavrov is saying, the reason for coming into Ukraine was because just after the coup in February 2014, just to remind people, on the 21st of February 2014, the government made an agreement with the largest opposition parties in order to solve the crisis that was in Maidan with those riots and violence and all that. They made an agreement. In this agreement, it was planned to have new elections, presidential elections, and that the government would remove all the law enforcement and security forces that were in the streets and all that. And in order to have a peaceful situation, and then they planned also, as I said, for these elections, new elections. The problem is that this treaty, this agreement, was monitored and guaranteed by France. I mean, the French foreign minister, the German foreign minister, and the Polish foreign minister. And the day after, on the 22nd of February, the agreement collapsed because the demonstrators, who were in fact ultra-nationalists, to use a polite word, in fact, took over the government building, stormed the presidential palace, and Yanukovych had to flee. And on the 23rd of February, the first decision made by the new non-elected government was to abolish the law that made Russian as an official language in Ukraine. And that's the starting point of
the
whole
Civil War.
revolution, almost a civil war that you had in the whole, not just in the Donbass, but in the whole of the southern part of Ukraine. From Odessa to Kharkov, you had in almost every single community or village or town, you had people revolt against the government. And from that point, the government tried to, they had not enough law enforcement units, so they committed the army, but the army was a conscription army, so half of the army was Russian speaking, meaning that those Russian speakers in the Ukrainian army defected to those who were in favor of Russian language, and the government had to compensate by using paramilitary forces, and that's the birth of those Azov and Pravi Sector and all these nationalist, ultra-nationalist militia that repressed brutally the riots and the demonstrations, that, and that in fact created the situation that we have now. And
and that part of the history that you've just talked about there literally never gets into the Western narrative. The only thing we hear about is that there was a popular uprising in 2014, and all of a sudden those darn Russians, little green men, came in out of nowhere and turned it against them. And you've talked about what that really was a lot of times, but unfortunately, that is what, when the Russians keep saying the root causes, what they're trying to get, it goes back to there. They talk about that. And
exactly.
Gary, I'm going to throw a little bit of a curveball here. If you can pull up the one that says Lavrov's ceasefire, here in that same interview we had with him a second ago is where he reiterates what their objective is.
The Europeans are trying to dominate the agenda with the rhetoric about ceasefire. They zigzagging, depending on what is going on the front line. Root causes, that's what must be key to understanding how to help end this situation efficiently.
So when you keep going back to what both Trump, what Lindsey Graham, and certainly Jack Keane a minute ago, they keep thinking we just put enough sanctions on Russia, it'll put pressure on them, it'll bring them to the table, and they'll just decide to stop fighting. That's what Trump said. Just quit fighting where you are on the current line of contact. But the Russians have methodically and monotonously said, root causes, we have to get that solved, which you just alluded to. How do you square the circle of what the Russians think the objective is and what the Americans / the West are trying to make the objectives?
Well, the problem is, and probably the answer to your question lies in fact in this interview that was shown. I discussed it once on your channel a long time ago. This is the interview of Alexei Arestovich on the 18th of March 2019, in which he explains that since there is a open crisis with Russia, Ukraine cannot enter NATO. So that means that in order to enter NATO, you need to have a war, Russia needs to be defeated, and if there is no Russia, then there is no crisis with Ukraine, and Ukraine can enter NATO. That was the idea. And remember that Alexei Arestovich at that time was the personal advisor to Zelensky. And in fact, what we have seen after that match exactly with what Arestovich said on this Ukrainian TV. You don't need even to rely on what Lavrov said. I mean, the Ukrainians have said all that in reality, but we don't want even to believe what Ukrainians said. These are the root causes, and that's for that reason. You may remember that in December, on the 17th of December 2021, the Russian government issued two memorandums, one to the US government, another to the Secretary General of the NATO, to ask to stop the enlargement of NATO, because they wanted, in fact, that the US, both the US and NATO would say a straight no to Zelensky because about the membership to NATO. Because the problem is, and you may remember, and that was witnessed by people I know in the OSCE, observers and all that. I mean, there is a lot of documentation on that, that in February 2022, 2022, the idea was to launch the war against, or to provoke a Russian intervention. And that's exactly what Orestovich said in 2019, where he even said that the war could start at the end of 2021 or beginning of 2022. So we are exactly in this, what Zelensky said. And the idea of provoking the conflict was precisely to be able to launch all those sanctions, or those massive sanctions on Russia, and to provoke the change of regime in Moscow. And just a few weeks ago, by the way, Zelensky repeated exactly that. You have to create hunger riots and things like this, and to create this regime change. And from this regime change, then the situation would be such that Ukraine would have no longer an enemy and therefore could enter NATO. And that's, this idea, since 2008, there was the idea of having Ukraine into NATO. But Russia didn't provide this memorandum before. It provided precisely when it felt that the tensions was rising in Ukraine, that the conflict was about to start, and therefore it was the last minute to tell both the US and NATO to tell, in fact, Zelensky that there will be no NATO, don't start a war, because regardless of what happened, you will not be in NATO. And incidentally, what happened, and you may remember that in March 2022, Zelensky said to CNN that in fact he asked Joe Biden whether Ukraine would be into NATO or not. And Joe Biden told him, the answer is no, you will not be in NATO, but for the public opinion, openly will say that you will. So there was obviously a manipulation there in order to create a situation of tension between Ukraine and Russia. And clearly, and still today, you see that the Europeans are helping, they are not really helping Ukraine, because we don't see exactly what they want to achieve with Ukraine. We know that the situation that we have, and many people have said that there is no way that Ukraine can recover the territory it has lost, and so on and so forth. So what is the objective, or what are the objectives of the Europeans? In fact, this is still the same one. The main objective is to weaken Russia, maybe to achieve any kind of regime change in Russia at the expense of Ukraine. And that's exactly what Lindsey Graham was even saying himself, that is the fight against Russia up to the last Ukrainian.
Yeah. And, the irony is, all that can accomplish is just to keep the war on life support, like an intravenous fluid. It can't win it. It can't even avoid defeat. Ultimately, it can just keep it going for a little bit longer. And then all of these big payments have to come to kind of like a big balloon payment. And I don't know how NATO, the West, is going to pay that bill when it comes due. But I don't see any path. In the last minute we have here, do you see any path, legitimate, viable, that this could end in any kind of a negotiated settlement, given where the West is? Or do you think it's going to have to be settled eventually on the battlefield by the Russians?
Well, the problem is that the only actor that is willing to go further into some kind of political solution is Donald Trump. The problem is, I'm not sure he's doing it the right way, because he's not.
I'm pretty sure he's not. I'll just throw that in there. So
sorry?
I'm pretty sure he's not doing it the right way. So
No,
we'll just
absolutely.
throw
I
that
mean,
in there.
he's obviously not putting the pressure where it needs. It's still sticking to some extent to this Keith-Kellogg plan, which we know the Russians will not accept. And although after the meeting in Anchorage, apparently Trump had understood the Russian position. And the communique that was provided by Marco Rubio, that is on the White House website, by the way, on the 17th of August, demonstrates that the Trump has understood the Russian position. The problem is that he understands that, but he made nothing to make something out of it. I mean, it's not enough to say, okay, I understand what you said, but then he should act on this and say, okay, we scrap the Keith-Kellogg plan. We have to adjust that or to adapt it in order to take into account Russian interests. Because the problem is that you can say whatever you want. The problem is that regardless of what you think about the Russians, they have the upper hand in Ukraine. That's a
Right.
fact.
So then we get last 30 seconds. Then where does that mean that how's this war going to be solved?
Well, I think either Trump made more effort to do what he wanted to do, or we'll have, as Josep Borrell said, he was the foreign minister of the European Union, he said, well, this conflict will have a solution on the battlefield.
That's the way my analysis sees it. And every time I keep looking at it, just looking for any kind of a viable, rational chance to have it solved somewhere else. I just don't see it for all the reasons you just mentioned. But we really appreciate you coming on and providing that clarity, because we are unintimidated and uncompromised to tell the truth, even when it's something we don't really like. And unfortunately, this is one of those cases right here, but it's good to know where we actually are. So in the event that maybe it becomes clear that that's going to manifest in an ugly way, there may yet be time for people to say, okay, let's stop this before it goes too far. There's always that hope, and only because of clarity from people like you. And we really appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting me. Thanks.
And we appreciate you guys very much too. Thanks. Good to be back in our regular digs here and back on a full speed. We will be back at 2:00 this afternoon. We're going to look at some additional aspects from that Sergei Lavrov interview that we showed before, some other comments from some Americans, and then we're also going to be looking at what in the world is going on in Venezuela. Are we heading to war there? We're going to be covering all that this afternoon at 2:00. We'll see you then on the Daniel Davis Deep Dive.